Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Cmsf. My name's Louise du Pre-Alba. I'm the Deputy President of AIST and I'm Strategic Policy Advocate for AustralianSuper. I'd like to welcome you to the session entitled The Regulators Radar. You might already know some of the people here. I'm delighted to introduce to you Stephen Glenfield on your far left. Stephen is the General Manager of the Southwest region of APRA, and so those funds that are in Victoria, WA and South Australia will already be familiar with working with Stephen. He's got the responsibility for managing the frontline supervision of super, banks and other deposit takers and insurers in those states. I also welcome Jane Eccleston. Is the senior executive leader, the new senior executive leader of investment managers and superannuation team at ASIC. And this team's responsible for ASIC's oversight of superannuation, managed funds and custodians. Also, I'd like to welcome James O'Halloran, Deputy Commissioner, Superannuation, Australian Taxation Office. James has national responsibility for the ATO's role in the regulation of APRA funds and self-managed super funds. He works closely with the super industry, as some of you will know, with its advisors and other regulatory agencies as well. And it's fair to say that the ATO is becoming the third regulator in super. Now, before we start the session, this session has always garnered a lot of discussion, and we expect people to conduct themselves and ask questions that are reasonable and appropriate in this forum, and I'm sure you will. But before we start, I've got an announcement to make. This has already been foreshadowed at the AIST AGM, but because we have regulators here, I think it's important to let you know what has happened. As Deputy President of AIST, I'm delighted to announce the appointment of members of the AIST Governance Code Monitoring Panel. This panel will monitor and oversee compliance with AIST's new governance code, which, as you know, comes into effect from the 1st of July this year for all AIST member funds. This panel will be chaired by Mr. Greg Brunner, who has more than 20 years' experience working for the World Bank and for APRA. Greg was the chair of APRA's Super Industry Working Group from 2011 to 2016 and helped develop governance, Prudential standards and guidance. The other two panel members are Marie O'Halloran. Marie is a past employer representative director of several profit-to-member funds, including her most recent role at Hester for 5 years. She is also a former recipient of AIST's Trustee of the Year. The third person is Michelle Wright. Michelle has nearly a decade of experience as a non-executive director across a range of financial services organisations and experience serving on ethical standards boards in the healthcare sector. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our panel members who play an important role in the sector as well as understand the code requirements and how they relate to the wider regulatory framework. So thank you. Now, before we start the session, I have to advise you to select the correct room under the session under Polls Live Q&A in the app. It's room number 4A. So the AXA Investment Managers Live Q&A is now open and it will be open for the duration of the session. So send your questions in via the Cmsf app. Okay. We shall now commence the session. Our first speaker will be Stephen Glenfield. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've done a few of these. The first time I did it, no one clapped, so that's pretty good. And this is a bit weird for me. Something this big, I feel a bit like Ed Sheeran standing here in an audience this big. Just so I'm better looking, obviously. So look, it's always a bit hard with these, what's on the regulators' radar about what to talk about. I could give you a laundry list of all the things we have on the go, but I thought what I'd start with is just a little bit of a background, really, if you like, about what we're trying to achieve, because I think that gives a good platform for the actual Prudential change program we have sitting out there at present. So from a purely frontline view, so I'm talking about your frontline supervisors who are going to come and see you, what is it that we're actually trying to understand in super? It's different to the banking world. As I said, I've got banking and insurance, and the financial promise there is pretty simple. In banking, you make a deposit. When I go back to get it, I should get my deposit. That's quite simple. In insurance, if I take out house cover, and it has happened to me, I take the family on a holiday, and I come back and the house is empty, I'm expecting the insurer will pay out for me to restock the house. Or if I've got life insurance, and heaven forbid I don't make it through the end of the week, that my family will be looked after through life insurance. Accumulation super, or DC super, is a bit harder. There's no absolute, hard, fast, obvious promise at the end, and I think it's one we've discussed over years over, well, what is it the regulator should be looking at? What is the promise we're looking for you as trustees and employees of the trustees to deliver to the members of the fund? And to me, ultimately, that is a good quality outcome for them. In terms of, I give you my money for maybe a 40-year work life, which I'm expecting you to manage it for me, and at the end of it, more and more increasingly, I'm going to stay with you through my retirement phase. I'm expecting a good quality outcome in that process. So for us, a big part of what we're trying to do with is to understand what that outcome is that you're actually promising. How well have you thought through the outcome, both leading up to retirement and post-retirement? And in delivering and thinking about that outcome, how good is your strategic planning, your business planning, to actually bring it for the members? And to do that requires a number of things. What we need to see is really strong governance around what you're doing, really strong planning around what you're doing, for you to actually understand what it is you're doing. And that's one of the first questions I ask every board I go to, and I do it here today for you to think about, is at the end of the day, in a really competitive environment, if I'm ignoring some default stuff, it's a really competitive environment and I've got my dollar of super, why would I give it to you? What is it that you, as RSEs and as a fund, deliver to me that makes it worth my while, and the outcome will be worth my while? So a great part of what we're trying to understand is where you go with setting what it is you're trying to deliver to members, how you actually plan to do it, how you go about delivering it, and how you communicate that so that your members know what it is that they're actually there for. To deliver that, we need a Prudential policy and Prudential standard environment that's fit for purpose for us to give guidance for what we expect to see in that area. And ultimately, we also need to do, and the one thing we probably haven't touched on as much in the past, is think about what's the resolution if it's not coming to pass. If you can't deliver what you thought you were going to do, how do you resolve from that point? So in terms of what we'll be doing going forward, in terms of my supervisors coming out, they'll be talking to you in that holistic term around what is it you're trying to deliver, how do you go about delivering it, and how do we have satisfaction that your governance arrangements around it are really strong. And in the event that you can't deliver what you're looking to deliver, what's your resolution plan around that? So to deliver that, we need a framework that's absolutely fit for purpose for that. And so we have a number of things on the agenda which we think will add to and help do that. Some of that will be around standards, some of it just is around guidance and best practice that we've seen. So firmly on the agenda, and if you go to APRA's websites and look up all the speeches that have been given where you've had more than 10 minutes, you'll see far more detail on some of these. But the key ones we've got coming up are around member outcome. So we're currently consulting on member outcome Prudential standards and guidance notes. Hopefully most of you are familiar with them, but within that there are requirements, proposed requirements around trustees setting strategic objectives for their business operations, maintaining written business plans that articulate your approach to meeting those objectives, and having robust expense management and reserving policies as part of your business planning. In addition to being able to articulate the outcomes you seek for members and the metrics you'll use to measure that progress. So that goes to the heart of the bit I talked about at the beginning, of being able to demonstrate that you know what you're doing for your members and what you're trying to deliver. The consultation period for that runs up until the 29th of March, and we've had lots of good interaction with industry to date, a number of good round tables, and we would be encouraging you to put in submissions on that. It's a very important piece of Prudential standard legislation for APRA. Other things that we'll be dealing with over the coming period, particularly around governance. Many of you would know that we've run 2 thematic reviews on governance over the last year around related party arrangements and board governance. These built on the conflicts thematic that we did a couple of years ago. They're basically looking at how the framework's been applied over the past couple of years since it was brought into play, looking for better practice and for practice that can be improved. So over the coming months, or very shortly, we're intending to come out to industry with the findings of those thematic reviews. It'll be similar to the other ones we've done, where it'll be a letter of some sort to the industry that highlights this is the better practice that we've seen, and this is the practice that we think needs to be improved. And what we'd be encouraging you to do is benchmark yourselves against that practice. And as part of our supervisory approach, we'll be coming out to talk to you about where you see yourself fitting against that and what you're doing to try and lift your level of governance in areas that you need to be reacting to. Other matters that we have on the go. One big piece of work that we are about to start is a post-implementation review. The Prudential standards came in 2013. At that point, we were committed to reviewing the framework a few years in to see whether we got it right, whether it was fit for purpose, whether we missed anything. So what we're aiming to do is to consult with industry over this coming year to seek that feedback. How did we go in setting that Prudential framework? Was there anything that we obviously missed, or is it pretty strong? So again, we're aiming to come out with the outcomes of that by the end of 2018. So again, I would encourage you to put your 2 pence in if you have views on where the framework currently sits. Other things we've got coming up, particularly around our data collection solution. So I'm sure most of you know what D2A is, that's the mode by which you submit data to APRA. APRA is putting a lot of emphasis now on financial analysis in terms of driving our supervision approach. So be rest assured that you don't just put returns in and they get forgotten about. They actually get reviewed each quarter, and we do base our risk assessment on those returns. Our current system is coming to the end of its useful life, so we're wanting to consult on a new data collection system that, again, we want industry input on what should be in there and what will work with you. So we have a team coming out to talk to institutions and to run some round tables, so I'd encourage you to put your hands up for those as well. We have released just recently a new Prudential standard on IT security. Whenever I go around to boards, the last question I ask every board is, what's keeping you awake at night? And it's invariably cybersecurity, from just about 90%. We recognise that as our heightened risk across all industries. So we've put out a new standard for consultation on IT security that we're looking to also finalise across the year. So that consultation is available on the website at present. And, sorry, flipping the wrong way. The other clear point that we do need to be looking at is post-retirement products. As I said, I think the industry's done by and large a really good job of accumulating, and I was making a speech overseas about the Australian system a few weeks ago. And so the interesting thing is we call them accumulation funds. It's a young system, and we call them accumulation funds, and the focus has really been on accumulation. There's been less discussion in the time that I've been involved in super around decumulation. But if you look at the statistics of people actually choosing to stay in the super system as opposed to taking lump sums and going elsewhere, it's rising each year. And I did a presentation, it must be about a year and a half ago, that showed it's now more money staying in than going out. So the decumulation phase to me has become the big important step we need to be looking at today. And so what we'll be seeking to understand from you is what products do you actually offer for the decumulation phase, and how comfortable are you that they're the right ones in terms of the outcome that you're looking for your members in that retirement phase. And finally, obviously, we couldn't go past without saying we are monitoring with interest what's happening with the Insurance and Super Working Group, and particularly with interest in new products that are being developed by funds as they're seeking to address some of the issues that we know are in play in insurance in the superannuation field. And with 1 second left, I'm going to leave it there and be happy to take questions later. There's plenty on the go, and I look forward to interacting with you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Jane?
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Like Stephen mentioned, there's a lot on the regulatory plate from an ASIC perspective as well. So in the interest of time today, I'm going to focus on 3 issues which are on ASIC's radar. So fees and cost disclosure, insurance and superannuation, and the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, AFCA. So as you know, Regulatory Guide 97, disclosing fees and costs in PDSs and periodic statements, to give it its full name, it sets out ASIC's view of the law, and this can be an area of the law which is quite complex to interpret. As well, the Regulatory Guide sets out, describes some modifications which were made by ASIC instruments which endeavoured to provide more certainty about the application of the law in this area. In November last year, ASIC appointed an expert to undertake a review of RG 97. So we did this in response to strong feedback from across all sectors of the industry. The practical implementation of the framework was challenging and complex. We also heard that RG 97 might not be achieving the goal of transparent fees and cost disclosure for consumers. So we took this feedback seriously, and in light of the fact that there were parts of the regime that had not yet been implemented, and other aspects which had been flagged for future consultation, we thought it was a really good opportunity to just pause and think before we sort of started implementation much further. So the review, the terms of reference of the review are actually on our website in the Q&A for RG 97. And really the terms of the review focus on 2 things. First, the value of fee and cost information for consumer decision-making and the extent to which it assists consumers in comparing products. So we mean by this not simply the consumer themselves comparing products, but also market analysis being undertaken as well. And the second focus is the practicalities and costs of producing this information. So we appointed Darren McShane as the expert to conduct the review. So he's recently returned from Hong Kong, where he was in a senior role at the Mandatory Provident Fund Schemes Authority. He was also chairman of the International Organisation of Pensions Supervisors Technical Committee. So he brings a fresh perspective, but a great depth of regulatory experience as well. So there are 3 things I wanted to tell you about the review. First, Darren is working hard. So he's been given volumes and volumes of material, all the relevant material that goes back for years. And he's also had a number of meetings and telephone hookups with stakeholders over the past few months to really understand the issues. I suppose one thing I should clarify here, that he's not really doing a sort of full consultation, but rather at this point he's information gathering. Second point that I wanted to make is that ASIC is doing what we can to support the expert and make this review a success. We've also been participating in some of the stakeholder engagement to make sure that we're learning through this process. And the third thing I wanted to highlight is the next steps in the process. So Darren's working towards the release of a public report in June, which will contain some recommendations. After this, ASIC will need to decide what it's going to do with those recommendations. In effect, if there are going to be significant changes to the regime, then ASIC would need to undertake its own consultation process. So given this review is still underway, I'm not really in a position today to tell you what the outcome is going to be, but I did want to reflect back some of the feedback that we've received about the issues that people have commonly identified with the current framework. So the sort of issues that people keep raising are the requirements are complex and difficult to implement. There's inconsistency between the fees and cost disclosure regimes for different products. So I'm talking about superannuation, managed investment schemes and platforms. There's been concerns raised about the ends versus means test in relation to identifying where the chain of interposed entities stops. In relation to property investments, there's been issues raised about whether it's entirely appropriate to treat listed and unlisted property investments in the way that they're treated under the framework. And there's also been questions raised about the benefit and usefulness of disclosing certain implicit costs, such as market impact costs. So another thing that we've commonly heard is that there's too much focus on fees and cost disclosure. From an ASIC perspective, we do think that fees and cost disclosure is important, but we do also acknowledge that there are other things that are quite important in investor decision making. For instance, it's important that consumers understand that some higher cost investments may produce higher net returns in the long term. So as I mentioned, we've got some information on our webpage, and we intend to keep updating that as the review progresses. So next I wanted to touch on insurance and superannuation, which is obviously an important issue given that it provides support for members and their families at a difficult period in their lives. So it's a key area of interest for ASIC. The Insurance and Superannuation Code, I think, is an acknowledgement that these areas are complex to challenge and that we're all working to address these. We certainly think that there is room for improvement in relation to the consumer experience of insurance and superannuation. So obviously there are issues such as members not having any idea that they actually have superannuation, that they're in a situation where they've got multiple superannuation accounts and they can't claim on more than one of the insurances that they have. And also some members have insurance that they don't need, yet continue to pay for. So we can appreciate that navigating issues like consumer understanding of insurance in super and inappropriate erosion of balances by insurance premiums is complex. So we think that the Insurance in Super Code of Practice is clearly an important and positive first step. But we've also been doing some project work looking at how industry practice is in relation to insurance issues, particularly on disclosure and complaints handling. So we flagged that our concerns around disclosure in insurance can concern us because poor disclosure can make it harder for people to engage with super. So we have found that the majority of trustees are doing some good things in terms of ensuring that the notification that people receive when their insurance cover is about to cease is not simply in the PDS but in subsequent notifications as well. But we have found some trustees who are not doing this and we've been following up with them. We see the code changes as really supporting the idea that members should be notified closer to the cease or change event for occurring, and this is very positive for consumers. We've also seen in our project work some default arrangements which we have concerns with. So I'm talking about things like in 10% of the cases that we looked at, people were still being defaulted as smokers in insurance. We're particularly pleased to see that the code focuses on the member needs in the complaint process as well as initial complaints handling. We think that these are important initiatives to give consumers greater confidence that they'll be treated fairly by their trustee. But in our project work, we have found that the mean time taken for trustees to finalise complaints is 117 days. Now, given that there's a 90-day requirement in the law, this is very concerning to us. Finally, I want to comment about complaints handling more generally and AFCA. So we obviously see internal and external dispute resolution as an important part of the consumer experience of superannuation. So we think in particular that trustees need to explain the complaint process well and give good written reasons for a decision that focus on the information needs of the consumer. So legislation to establish the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, AFCA, was recently passed. This is going to be a new one-stop shop for financial services complaints, including superannuation. And we've recently released a consultation paper which outlines how ASIC is going to oversight AFCA's operations. Now, AFCA is going to start accepting complaints no later than 1 November 2018. So there will be steps that need to be taken by superannuation trustees to join the scheme and also consider updating the disclosures made about complaints handling in the meantime. There will be transitional arrangements in relation to the SCT. But I wanted to particularly focus on the current legislative IDR requirements of superannuation trustees. So as I mentioned, these are currently 90 days and require written reasons are given. As part of the update to internal and external dispute handling, ASIC will need to consider updating its regulatory guidance about that 165. So we're going to be consulting on that later, but we're not going to consult until after AFCA has started operations. And a key focus of our consultation will be maximum IDR timeframes. So as I've mentioned, 90 days is the current requirement, which is historically applied to superannuation. Our project work suggests that it's not currently being met by a number of trustees. We have to raise the question as to whether that timeframe should be even shorter. So I suppose that the key message I wanted to leave you with in relation to AFCA is that it's a really good time to consider your internal and internal dispute resolution processes ahead of any changes which are going to come in with IDR reforms. We want to really support the smooth implementation of AFCA arrangements in financial services, including superannuation. And I'm a minute over, so I'm going to leave there, even though I could talk about a lot of other things that ASIC's going to do this year.
Thank you, Jane.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share this conference with you. Look, I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts, really, what's euphemistically called the journey of reform over the last, I'm not sure it's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years or 10 years, but whatever, we've certainly all been on a journey, and I think the ATO have certainly been well and truly conscious of that for the industry. And the main thing is, I think that some of the things that I'll touch on highlight that, in fact, whether it's a partnership, alliance, or conversely just working together for good outcomes for members is particularly important and remains important for us, even though at times we obviously have different roles in the system itself. But I think the recent reforms over the last 12 months or so have highlighted that, in fact, when we come together early enough, often enough and in good faith, good outcomes can flow, whether it be through meeting of the minds or a recognition of each other's different perspectives. Of course, I'm sure that in all our minds at the moment, of course, there's a need to be prepared for perhaps what might be the next round of reforms or perhaps outcomes from various reviews. And of course, clearly those matters will take their own course. But certainly from the ATO's point of view, we think we've learned some things over the last 12 months about how to partner with you in both operational ways, design ways, and also in terms of meaningful certainty where the Commissioner can assist. And so I think those lessons, certainly from our point of view, we'd like to continue. Indeed, as an agency, we've been through our own reform, and it's best summarised for today's purposes that, in fact, we've tried to move to an agency over the last couple of years where, like yourselves, the client experience is, in fact, essential. Whether you call it the client experience or the member experience, I think the intention is the same. But of course, from ours, like your point of view, the integrity of the superannuation system as a whole is important, and therefore engendering trust in our perspective, in confidence in both the tax and superannuation system remains essential. Now, in fact, while major reforms have been happening for the last 12 to 15 months, a lot of superstream services have also continued to progress and mature because of your support. And indeed, there's been approximately 10 million successful super tick validation processes over the last 12 months, which is almost double on the previous year. However, of course, ahead is single touch payroll, event-based reporting and superannuation guarantee considerations. Now, in fact, in December of last year, fund reporting for APRA funds on the transfer balance cap commenced. And in fact, for the month of January, we issued about 3,000 excess transfer balance cap determinations, which of course is a relatively small amount and well within expectations. And of course that's become because of a lot of work to prepare people to consider what might be their best course of action in terms of their transfer balance. And indeed next month the fourth annual ATO APRA fund diagnostic reports, which for us are an important governance mechanism, will be released. But the main message today is that overall the funds meeting the benchmark, there's 13 benchmarks, has actually increased, and that 8 out of the 13 indicators have been particularly solid and particularly around TFN and timeliness of reporting. Superannuation guarantee is certainly already been mentioned in this conference in previous sessions, and it remains of great interest to the ATO, like yourselves, and of course the level of non-payment. Through this year, under the current law, we've continued to maintain our focus in dealing with the apparent non-payment of super guarantee through our role and the SGC system. We've increased our SG cases completed by about 98%. We've raised approximately $509 million from all of our superannuation guarantee casework. We've increased by 150% our ATO-initiated casework. And as importantly, we've actually contacted, year to date, some 12,000 employers as a result of reviews or audits. And last year, in a full year, we'd contacted some 16,000. So my main point is that we continue to focus on that by improving some of our procedures, but also introducing some greater insights through data. Now, in the coming year, the government's announced that there will be provided to the ATO, subject to other processes, Super Guarantee Task Force, which will extend our current compliance activities, and it will actually provide greater scrutiny and additional scrutiny on sophisticated data and analytics and debt collection. And it will operate for 3 years, from 1 July 2018. A few other areas that I'd just like to touch on. The high priority for this year going forward will be successor fund transfers, but also change in administrator or changes in IT platforms. Data integrity always remains important. We're currently assisting some 11 successor fund transfers across multiple funds, and of course we're willing to help where we can. Of course, it's always been in our collective interests, I think, for people to be reunited with their superannuation. That continues often with industry as well as across the ATO. Over the past 4 financial years, about 1.68 million accounts to the value of $8.12 billion have been consolidated, transferred or claimed by fund members. And for this financial year to date, we've observed that some 189,000 individuals were reunited with 310,000 lost, unclaimed or active superannuation accounts to the value of $1.8 billion. Of interest perhaps is that 60% of the individuals who took action were aged 25 to 40, with more women than men taking action to find their lost or unclaimed super. The ATO, as you know, holds unclaimed super, and as at 31 January, we held some 5.38 million of unclaimed super to the value of 3.83 billion. Looking ahead, we'll be contacting some 100,000 people in the next few months to encourage them to take active action to reunite themselves with unclaimed monies that the ATO holds. In terms of some context, whilst the number of people with multiple accounts has been falling, which is pleasing for us all, there are still some 2.3 million Australians with 3 or more superannuation accounts. I just want to touch on some engagement on the ground with the community, whether it be in regional areas or whether it be in disadvantaged areas or the Indigenous community. We're aware that reuniting people with their superannuation, certainly in the circumstances of death, has been difficult. And we do plan to change our procedures over the next few months, which will allow Indigenous relatives who can provide a copy of their death certificate, or the death certificate, and who can verify their own identity to the satisfaction of the ATO, to be able to provide information, so the ATO can provide information as to whether there is in fact a superannuation account exists. It doesn't allow access to the money, but it certainly at least identifies whether there is in fact some money to be further action to be taken with the fund. Looking ahead, event-based reporting with APRA funds begins to show the light in terms of the system in operation. And of course that system and process is well underway and indeed well past concept, including the upcoming reporting of super guarantee information. And indeed, based on formal advice from trustees over the last few months, we're expecting that 42% of APRA funds will have completed their member attribution service onboarding by November, and this will also include the commencement of super guarantee reporting. This will potentially surface SG payment data for approximately 64% of APRA fund member accounts. So in closing, finally across a range of fronts, As I've indicated this afternoon, we've come a long way together in turning concepts into reality, to opening the system and also producing information which increasingly shows the system in operation and is of mutual benefit. And of course we are, I think, better prepared, subject to keeping an eye on the lessons over the last 12 to 15 months in the way we work with industry, that in fact we are well prepared for future changes or conversely for further improvements to make the system work better. There is a more detailed paper that will be available expanding on some of the comments that I've touched on, and I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to touch on a few points for this afternoon's session. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Now, I will open it up for questions now. You can do questions through the CMSF app, Forum A, as described before, and there's a few questions already. Or alternatively, if you want to put your hand up and introduce yourself and ask a question, you can do that as well. There are people around with microphones who can deal with that. Of course, it'll be dependent on me being able to see you, so that could be slightly problematic at times. There are a couple of questions that I want to go with to start. And I note some people have put their names to them, some are anonymous, so I'm going to exercise a bias in favour of those who've given their names. The first one I've got here is for Jane. It's from Nicole Oborn from PwC. And it says, Jane, are RAP platforms captured under RG97 transparency requirements? Can ASIC put an end to this debate of expectations?
So, in some ways, platforms are captured under RG97. They're captured in the sense that both the platform and the underlying investments each need to produce PDSs, which have the fees and costs disclosure. So this is an issue that a number of people have raised in relation to RG97, and all I can say at this point in time is that it's an issue that Darren has been talking to a lot of people about and is thinking about in the context of the review.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, I've got a number of questions about superannuation guaranteed payments, James. So the first one from Nick Fodor from CBUS, any prospect of moving SG payments from quarterly to monthly?
That's a matter for government. What would you expect me to say? The current law is as it is, and whilst there's been a lot of public discussion, clearly the government's position at this stage is not to go there as far as I'm aware, and therefore we administer as it is, and that's truthfully the best answer I can give today.
Okay, so how would that same answer work for the gig economy? Because we've had a lot of discussion, and indeed in this conference today there's been a lot of discussion about the gig economy, which is about casual workers, part-time workers, but also contractors, subcontractors, sham contractors, and we're interested in your view about SG and how that plays out in the new gig economy that we're all experiencing.
Well, I think there's two things. One is obviously the gig economy is about SG, but it's also not about SG. It's around, as was touched on in this morning's session, it's around a wider range of issues that are challenging laws, but also the nature of the evolution of business models and relationships, as was touched on in this morning's plenary session. Look, from the SG point of view, the simplest way to in fact improve the level of payment of SG, leaving aside issues and discussions around the size of non-payment, is quite simply for employers to pay SG that's entitled to people. The ATO currently has a role to make sure, as I've touched on this morning, that we continue to try and find ways to improve and engage with employers across the full spectrum of tools in terms of changing behaviour. And of course, I think it's pretty common knowledge that some of the views around the payment of SG may be connected to the timing of it, but also as much around an attitude that it is an entitlement that even under the current law, certain people are entitled to have. And we think our best efforts as the administrator is to continue to improve our work to try and identify, educate and also enforce the law. I touched on that the government has announced, but of course it needs to go through the parliamentary process, a number of what's called the SG integrity package, which does two things. One is it continues to formalise the journey that funds have agreed to do with us, to be candid, which is reporting the payments of SG for their fund members. That gives us greater visibility on the, if you like, the pattern as well as the incidence of payment to individual employees. And secondly, it also gives us some extra enforcement tools around, if you like, director penalty notices and the like. So how it would play, how the gig economy and those things play out, I think are not best looked at starting through SG. I think if we all concentrate on getting all players to carry out their current obligations, of course that would be the best outcome, and I've tried to outline today some of the issues that we've been doing to continue to try and reduce the gap in relation to the not only the reason for non-payment of SG, but also to move more swiftly to investigate and obviously seek to collect superannuation guarantee.
Thanks for that, James. I've got a couple of questions bubbling up around the issues of governance and also about the issues of culture. But before I get onto those, I was going to bother you for one more tax question. It's from Jeff Warner from AustralianSuper. James, do you think the ATO sees itself as having a larger role in assisting with the consolidation of accounts?
Well, the short answer is the ATO are always willing, within the current law, to reunite people with their superannuation. I indicated some figures in the quick intro. I don't think we're making an insignificant contribution at all, and in fact, a lot of our effort, when one looks at the amount of, if you like, lost super that's held by funds, it is an extremely large figure, and I think we have a good partnership in the sharing of information to allow funds themselves to reunite with, have their members reunited with the funds, with their superannuation guarantee payments. And obviously, as I've touched on from the so-called money that the ATO holds, the unclaimed super, we have some significant campaigns. I think the best way I'd answer that question directly, if there's something within the current law that people think the ATO can assist a fund, or conversely in the way in which we run the campaigns to reunite people with the superannuation guarantee or the superannuation that the ATO holds, more than happy to have dialogue. And of course, some of you are aware, or perhaps I need to state, that superannuation that's held by the ATO, so-called unclaimed monies, the current law does not allow us to automatically reunite people with their superannuation. It has to be a conscious decision of the member concerned. But certainly, I mentioned 100,000 people. That's certainly an indication of some active reach out, and we'll continue to do that in any way we think that we can at least give people an opportunity to reunite themselves with their super. But happy to continue to work with individual funds or more broadly if there's an improvement that's needed there.
Well, the call is there. Thanks, James. Now, I've got a question from Stuart for Stephen. Isn't the industry fund model with board structures / good governance best practice?
Welcome to CMSF. And I have had that question every time I've come. Look, we're on record as saying we think that, and I'm assuming we're talking about the independent director model, correct me if I'm wrong. We're on record as saying we think independent directors bring benefit to boards in terms of added skills and ability to challenge, and we don't step back from that. We still think that independent directors add, and if I look at some of the bigger performers in the industry funds, numbers of them have independent directors on their boards. That's not to say I say the model is a problem in the field we're talking about here, but our genuine belief at APRA, looking across all industries that we supervise, is that independent directors bring benefit.
Okay. I have a question over here and another one over here, so I'll go to this gentleman first. It's got the mic.
Is it the role of APRA to advocate the mandating of a political decision like this? Wouldn't it be better if the regulator weren't to step in on this?
Can I get that again? I didn't quite.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying is it the role of the regulator to advocate a position around governance?
Okay. So in terms of, it's our role to talk about what we think is best practice in governance and setting standards in terms of governance. And so to that extent, I think we have a role in saying what we think represents better practice.
Okay. Did I have another question up here?
Yes, Karen Volpato from AIST to Jane and Stephen. Has there been any discussion between ASIC and APRA about how the target market product distribution proposed test and the member outcomes test through APRA will interact?
We've certainly had some discussions about DDO and PIP. I just can't resist using the acronyms. But at this stage, it's still early days in terms of those regimes, so we haven't had, as I understand it, any specific focused discussion about the member outcomes and those two pieces of legislation, but they obviously interact, and that's something that ASIC would need to be cognisant if it was going to act under those powers, the APRA position in relation to member outcomes.
And I would just add that we have APRA-ASIC liaison where we would go through, this is what we've got coming up and this is what it does, and that would be the forum that would get bubbled to the top.
Yeah.
Okay, that leads me to a question about the member outcomes test. Stephen, can you explain how the scale test replacement will apply to choice products when the scale test under legislation didn't apply to those products?
Okay, so the member outcome test for APRA, we've always had the view, and I sort of talked about it there, that good outcome applies whether it is a MySuper product or it's a choice product. And so the standard that we've drafted around outcomes is around outcome for members regardless of how they came to you. So whether they're in a MySuper product or in a choice product, it's for the trustee to sit back and make an assessment over what are the outcomes you're trying to produce for those members, and is whether what you're doing actually producing that, or do you need to make changes going forward. So that whilst the Act itself is about MySuper, the APRA standard is a recognition that the trustee's fiduciary duty is across all members, and so we've brought it into the net that way.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, so there's quite a few likes on the questions around ESG and the good work that APRA is doing on the E and G aspects of ESG guidance is welcome, but where is APRA at in reviewing its prudential guidance on the S factors, on social?
Right. So I think as part of our broader review of the prudential standards, we would be looking for feed on that area, and believe me, there are a number of bodies happy to feed me on that area at this point.
Okay. I've got another one for you, Jane. I'm watching the time very carefully. Can you please comment on what the regulators, what you'll be focusing on in relation to financial advice? We've had a bit of discussion. We've been observing Senate committees talking about vertical integration and whether there's vertical integration in industry super, for example.
Yeah, so as people probably appreciate, we've recently put out a report which looked at financial advice in vertically integrated banks and insurance company. And really our focus was looking at how the best interest duty was carried out within that structure, primarily because that particular structure has some conflicts which are embedded in it. And so we wanted to explore how those conflicts played out in practice and whether they were actually being managed appropriately. Our interest is really not in any particular business models, but rather it's in ensuring that people get the advice in accordance with the requirements of the Act, which are, of course, that the advice is given in people's best interests. We probably will do some work in relation to other vertically integrated business models, including superannuation, but this is not to be a sort of, we think necessarily that advice within those structures is bad, but rather we just need to ensure that the advice that is given is the advice that meets members' needs.
Okay. Last question for Stephen. It's from Louise Davidson from ASIC. APRA has made a number of statements about the importance of managing climate risk recently. And are you discussing this with funds? And any observations?
Okay, so, yeah, so we think we're talking the speeches Jeff Summer-Hayes has been making. And so we've been highlighting climate risk as something that shouldn't be ignored. It's something that you should be factoring into your thought process on, again, in interests of members and what we're investing in. We've got a small group at APRA that's working at present to pull together some tools for our supervisors to use in the field. So I'd expect in the coming 2018 to add to the list of things that I said we were doing. Part of that will be they'll come with some questions just on how you're handling it and how you're dealing with it. That the supervisors are not experts in the world of climate and can't pretend to be experts, but they will just be discussing with you, well, what's your view and what are you doing about it?
Great. Look, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone. Please thank the speakers. Thank you all. Thanks for your time. Your gift is a donation to the First Nations Foundation. Okay, afternoon tea will now take place in CMSF Central, proudly supported by our premium partner, Insight Investments. Thank you, everyone.